You are listening to ProveText, a GlossaHouse podcast exploring scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello, friends. This is Michael Halcomb here, and in this short episode of ProveText, I am going to share with you an essay I wrote some years ago titled The Pronunciation of Koine Greek. This comes from the appendix of Fred Long's Koine Greek Grammar. So here we go. In the same way that it's in our best interest to learn the grammatical and syntactical ins and outs of Koine Greek, as Fred's book has helped us do, it's to our benefit to have some understanding of the issues surrounding the matter of pronunciation. Because the majority of English to Greek grammar books employ the so-called Erasmian pronunciation. I say so-called because Erasmus himself did not adopt it, and because professors have been using such textbooks for the last several hundred years. The overwhelming majority of students have accepted this framework without much question. Indeed, many have been taught that recovering any semblance of how Koine originally sounded is beyond a possibility. Such a claim, however, simply misses the mark. The reality is that we can know how Koine sounded. There are a number of resources readily available and at our disposal that can assist us in this regard. And before I mention just a couple of these, however, it'll be helpful to understand a bit about the context out of which Erasmian took root and grew. For me, this historical data is important and shouldn't be divorced from discussions about whether Erasmian should continue to be used. At the same time, it's not the nail in the coffin, so to speak, or the strongest bit of information we have to move away from Erasmian to the KEP, Koine era pronunciation. KEP. With regard to context, the 1400s to 1600s AD or CE in Europe are worthy of note, especially the locales of Greece and England. Given that I cannot provide an in-depth discussion of every significant event or person worthy of mention here, I must be selective. I want to draw our attention first then. The fact that in the years preceding the 1400s, French and Latin were prominent across Europe, but French was the language of power, politics, and social prestige. There came a shift around the 1500s, however, when French began to be replaced by English. While there were many dialects of English, a standard began to emerge as it was developed at the behest of royalty. The chancery, that is the chapel of the king, consisted of scribes and writers who worked at creating an English standard among themselves. And eventually, the standard began to proliferate as it was used increasingly outside the chancery. As English replaced French as the norm and as the chancery's English standard gained momentum, other institutions, especially the academy, began to take note and follow suit. These changes happened quite organically and, relatively speaking, over a period of hundreds of years. This move toward an English standard also played a role in what's known as the Great Vowel Shift. I can't explain the shift here at length, but it's worth pointing out that basically the vowels A, E, I, O, and U, along with AI, all shifted and took on a different sound at this time. The influence of this change is hard to overestimate because even today's English remains directly affected by it. As it was occurring across the late 1400s to mid 1600s, those living at the time were also dramatically affected by it. We need to realize that Erasmus himself lived during this period, a period when matters pertaining to French, Latin, and English, especially the latter, English, were very socially and politically charged. The pronunciation of English was at the forefront of many debates and discussions. But this brings us to another matter, namely the pronunciation of Greek. Following the Turkish invasion and conquering of the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire in 1453 AD, or again CE, for the first time a sharp distinction was beginning to be made between ancient Greek and modern Greek. That's really important. Prior to this point, no one had ever really differentiated the two in such a substantive way and in such an aggressive historical manner. In the minds of many, the political misfortunes of the Greeks confirmed that they were weak and intellectually backward, and this caused non-Greeks to despise them and avoid their language. This also caused Greeks to strive to maintain their ethnic identity, which led them to turn in upon themselves, jealously preserving their language and culture. As one author says, the use of the modern Greek pronunciation for the ancient language was only part of this larger phenomenon. Thus, for the Greeks, the pronunciation of the language was a matter of national pride. Yet, here, for the first time, ancient Greek, and for our purposes, Koine Greek, was essentially declared dead. What had existed unbroken for thousands of years, despite its various permutations and changes, was now considered deceased. But the question must be asked, who declared it a dead language? And the follow-up question, why? We can't necessarily pin the event of rendering Koine a dead language on one person. But when we look to figures such as the Spanish humanist Antonio Nebria, who asserted that Hebrew, Greek, and Latin had ran their courses, and who spoke of, quote, national awakening in all parts of the West, end quote, we learn that he may have been an early catalyst for changing the pronunciation of Greek. Nebria knew Erasmus. And in fact, Erasmus may have first heard of the non-historical pronunciation from Nebria. It should be pointed out here that Erasmus himself never adopted what later became known as the Erasmian pronunciation. In fact, Erasmus held to a modern Greek pronunciation. What happened was that Erasmus wrote a fable about a lion and a bear using different Greek pronunciations, one which was based on modern Greek and the other which was based on English, and this tale became widely popular. As matters of language change were on the rise, and as Greeks were ousted from their academic teaching posts in ancient literature departments and replaced by non-native Greek speakers, as the historian and grammarian A.N. Yanaris notes, quote, the first act was to do away with the traditional pronunciation, which reflects perhaps the least changed part of the language, and then to declare Greek a dead tongue, end quote. Many jumped on the bandwagon with this thinking. Then, with enough academic elites and social powerhouses on board, the new English-based pronunciation of Greek began to spread quickly. Fredrick J, a professor and author living in the 1800s, who even in his time referred to the Greeks of his day as half-barbarians and their pronunciation as barbaric, along with numerous other leading thinkers such as Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Johann Sturm, and their many associates and followers, had adopted Erasmus's teaching methods and textbooks as the basis of their educational reforms. And to be sure, Erasmus talked about pronunciation in some of his works, especially the aforementioned fable. And this led people to believe that he himself was an advocate of the pronunciation that became attached to his name. These circumstances reveal that the socio-political climate of the day was ripe for the proliferation of the Erasmian pronunciation. Thus, there was not simply one person responsible for the so-called death of Koine, but rather many in the academy. Declaring Greek dead was a socio-political move. Indeed, it allowed the academy, the academics, to drive a wedge between ancient and modern Greek. And in doing so, the academics could refer to ancient Greek as their Greek, while the modern Greeks could deal with modern Greek. This division, a false historical dichotomy between ancient and modern Greek, has persisted even until today in the academy. The main progenitors of it have been Western colleges, universities, and seminaries. In my opinion, it would not only be a just act, but also a historically responsible one to move away from Erasmian to the KEP, Koine era pronunciation. And in spite of the oft-heard claim that we cannot know it, we surely can, as I've suggested already. One of the main ways that we can recover the KEP is by comparing orthographical substitutions, that is, spelling interchanges between documents containing the same text or the same words across different documents. I prefer to call these spelling differences interchanges rather than mistakes or errors, as some like Bart Ehrman do, because they were in fact not errors. To arrive at such a conclusion, one must force modern expectations about reading and writing back onto ancient authors and scribes. Before the rise of modernism, what was written, literary works, letters, documents, etc., was meant to be read aloud and were composed for the ear. Thus, as long as what was on the page produced the proper sounds and words when spoken, it was considered good, acceptable, and meaningful. To use a very simple example from English, we might say that when spoken aloud, the word mean, M-E-E-N, in the statement, the boy is mean, produces the correct sound to hearers, although it is misspelled. It's misspelled mean, rather than our modern standard of mean, M-E-A-N. Yet M-E-E-N, mean, would nonetheless have been understood by hearers. In fact, if one were to write an entire lecture with words whose spellings were considered atypical, the audience would likely never know about the spelling interchanges. The only way they would know is to look at the manuscript. If they were to view the manuscript, they would see then the non-standard spellings rather than the well-known standard spellings. If listeners were to do this, they'd realize that the English EE and EA make the same sound and are to the ear completely interchangeable. This is actually one way that we can go about figuring out how Koine sounded too. If we compare how words were spelled in ancient writings to a more common standard spelling, we can recover which letters sounded alike or different. For instance, one ancient work spells the number 3 as tris, iota sigma. When we compare this with the standard spelling, tris, tavro epsilon iota sigma, we learn that Koine, iota, and epsilon iota were often interchanged and thus sounded nearly exactly alike. In addition to comparing non-standard spellings with standard spellings, we can often just compare words across a single document. For instance, in Papyrus 66, the scribe used both tris, tavro iota sigma, and tris, tavro epsilon iota sigma. Even though they're spelled differently in the document, they made the same sound when read aloud and were thus considered good and acceptable. Beyond this type of analysis, many other ways to recover the kep exist. We can read, for example, ancient texts that talked about pronunciation. We can look for rhyme and assonance in poetry. This gives us clues as to which letters and syllables sounded alike. We can use tools from the field of historical phonology or linguistics to help chart both synchronic and diachronic sound change. At the end of the day, it's simply erroneous to claim that we cannot know how Koine sounded. The bald claim that such a task is beyond recovery finally needs to be put to rest. As scholars, researchers, teachers, and learners, our role should not be to regurgitate statements we may have read or heard along the way without checking to see whether or not they can be substantiated. Instead, if we're in the business of teaching truth and doing so in a true manner, then we will let the evidence lead us. I'm convinced, with regard to the pronunciation of Koine, that such evidence abounds. For this reason, I have left Erasmian behind and embraced the Koine era pronunciation.